In 2001, a team of researchers at the University of Leicester did something that sounds like the setup to a joke. They divided dairy cows into groups, piped different music into their barns for 12 hours a day over 9 weeks, and measured how much milk each group produced. The music included REM, Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, and Wonderwall by Oasis, Beethoven 1. The cows exposed to slow classical music produced about 3% more milk per day than the control group. Fast music, including Oasis, produced no effect. Silence produced no effect. The finding made international headlines, almost entirely as a punchline. Cows prefer Beethoven. Cows have taste. Cows are secretly classical music fans. None of that is what the study found, and what it actually found is considerably more interesting. The first thing to understand is that 3% sounds modest until you do the math. A commercial dairy herd in the UK averages around 200 cows. 3% of daily output across 200 cows sustained over a full year is a significant number, enough that the finding wasn't dismissed by farmers, it was adopted. Farms across Europe started piping music into barns, not as a novelty, as an operational decision, which means the effect was real enough to be worth money. The question is, what produced it? To understand that, you have to understand how a cow produces milk. The process is not purely mechanical. Milk production is heavily regulated by hormones, and the most important one at the moment of milking is oxytocin. When a calf nurses, or when a cow is being milked in a calm, familiar environment, oxytocin releases and milk flows. When a cow is stressed, cortisol suppresses that release. The cow may have milk, the cow may simply not let it go. This is why the conditions of milking matter so much to dairy farmers. A cow that is startled, uncomfortable, or in an unfamiliar environment will not produce the same yield as a cow that is calm and settled. The body is not cooperating with the process. The stress response is blocking it. Now consider what slow music does to a nervous system, any nervous system. Slow, predictable, rhythmic sound signals environmental safety. The acoustic environment of an animal being actively hunted is chaotic. Sudden sounds, irregular rhythms, silence that breaks without warning. An environment filled with slow, consistent, non-threatening sound communicates the opposite. Nothing is wrong. Nothing is coming. The body can relax. For a prey animal that has spent millions of years tuning its threat detection system to auditory cues, the acoustic texture of the surrounding environment is not background noise, it's data. Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony has a tempo that sits well below 100 beats per minute in most of its movements. It is predictable. It resolves. It does not spite unexpectedly into high-frequency stabs or sudden percussion. The nervous system of a dairy cow, which is exquisitely sensitive to acoustic threat signals, registers that environment is safe. Cortisol stays low, oxytocin flows, the milk comes. The same thing happened with Bridge Over Troubled Water in the Leicester study, a slow pop ballad. Nothing to do with classical music, everything to do with tempo. Here's the part the headlines missed entirely. It wasn't Beethoven, it was slow. Any sufficiently slow, non-startling piece of music produced the same basic result. The researchers tested the genre because genres were the obvious variable to test. What they were actually measuring, without initially framing it that way, was the effect of acoustic tempo on bovine cortisol regulation. The cows didn't care about the composer, they cared about the beats per minute. Now consider cow hearing, because this is where it gets interesting. Cows hear frequencies from about 23 Hz up to 35,000 Hz. Their upper range is almost twice that of humans. They are particularly sensitive to high-frequency sounds, which in their evolutionary history meant predators. A sudden, high-pitched sound moves a cow faster than almost any other stimulus, which means a piece of music with significant high-frequency content, even at slow tempo, is landing on a nervous system primed to read those frequencies as threat signals. Classical orchestration from the Baroque and Classical periods tends to avoid harsh high-frequency stabs. It uses strings primarily, which produce overtones that are harmonically rich but not jagged. The sound is full without being alarming. A lot of modern rock and pop, even at slow tempos, has frequency content in ranges that might read differently to a cow's threat detection system. Beethoven, accidentally, happens to sit in a frequency range that a cow's nervous system processes as benign. Nobody thought about this when Beethoven wrote it. He was not composing for dairy cows, but the physics of how his instruments and orchestration interact with bovine auditory neurology is not nothing. Do cows have individual preferences beyond this? That's a harder question, and the evidence is more contested. A 2014 study observing free-ranging beef cattle found that the animals showed consistent approach behavior toward music played from a field speaker, but only for certain types of music. They moved toward slower pieces and showed avoidance behavior toward pieces with heavy percussion or irregular rhythm. That part is consistent with everything else, but within the category of slow music, different individuals spent different amounts of time near the speaker. Some stayed, some lost interest quickly, some returned. Whether that constitutes a preference in any meaningful sense, or whether it's just natural variation in the threshold at which individual animals habituate to a novel stimulus, researchers genuinely disagree. The honest answer is that we have good evidence cows respond differently to different acoustic environments. We do not have good evidence that any individual cow has a favored composer. What we do have evidence for is something subtler and in some ways more interesting. Cows in barns are not experiencing silence anyway. There are fans, machinery, other animals, human activity. Complete silence in a barn would itself be unusual and potentially alerting. What music does, in part, is not just introduce a calming stimulus, it also masks the irregular, unpredictable noises that trigger the stress response in the first place. A sudden clang from machinery is less startling when it happens inside a consistent acoustic landscape than when it punctuates a quiet room. The music is working on multiple levels simultaneously. It's providing a tempo signal that says everything is fine, it's providing a frequency environment that doesn't activate threat detection, and it's providing a consistent acoustic baseline that makes unexpected sounds less salient. The result is a cow that is physiologically calmer over the course of the milking day, and a calmer cow produces more milk. The mechanism is real. The effect is real. Beethoven just happens to check all the boxes. Here's the question that's genuinely hard to answer. Is any of this appreciation? There is an experience happening in those barns. The cows are not indifferent to the sound. Their bodies are responding to it in measurable, physiologically significant ways. Whether that response is accompanied by anything like what you experience when a piece of music moves you, something felt rather than just processed, nobody can say. We don't have access to the inside of a cow's experience any more than we have access to the inside of a fish's or a bat's. The behavior tells us something is happening. It doesn't tell us what it's like. Some researchers argue this means the question of preference is meaningless for an animal like a cow. You can't prefer what you can't consciously experience. Others argue that's an unfairly narrow definition of preference, that a nervous system responding differently to different stimuli and producing behavioral patterns as a result is a form of preference, whether or not there's a subjective experience attached to it. The cows don't care about this argument. They're standing in the barn, the pastoral symphony is playing, their cortisol is low and their oxytocin is flowing, and the milk is coming, and none of that required them to have an opinion about Beethoven. But the milk came, the bodies responded, and every farm that made the decision to pipe slow classical music into its barns did so because the effect was real enough to act on. Whether you call that appreciation or just biology, the outcome is the same. The music played, the cows were different, and Beethoven, who composed the Pastoral Symphony in 1808 to evoke the peace of the Austrian countryside, would probably find it fitting that 200 years later it's still making something feel calm enough to let go.